In this episode of Dads Under Pressure, I'm talking about becoming a father young, growing up through pressure, and how early responsibility can shape a man's identity for years. This episode's about young fatherhood, survival patterns, grief, pressure, identity, and the strengths and blind spots that can come from growing up through duty instead of time. A lot of people talk about growing up fast, like it's automatically a good thing. They say it like it's a compliment, like it means maturity, resilience, toughness, discipline. And sometimes it does mean some of those things. Sometimes a man who had responsibility early really does become stronger in important ways. He becomes dependable, he becomes practical, he becomes the kind of person other people can lean on. But I think what gets talked about far less is what it actually costs to grow up through responsibility instead of growing up through time. Because there is a difference. There is a difference between maturing naturally with space and being shaped by pressure before you have really had the chance to understand yourself. And I think that difference stays with a man for a long time. This episode is about that. It is about becoming a father young. It's about responsibility arriving before identity is fully formed. It's about what happens when life gets serious early and you become useful before you become emotionally clear. It's about the strengths that come through that kind of life, but also the blind spots, the hardness, the silence, the self-neglect, and the survival patterns that can stay in the system long after the original moment has passed. I became a father at 18. And when I look back now, what stands out is not just that I had a child young. It's the speed with which life changed shape. It's how quickly everything became more serious. It's how fast my decisions stopped feeling like they belonged only to me. It's how early pressure became normal. I think that's one of the biggest things people miss when they talk about early responsibility. They often speak about the event itself, but not about the internal reorganization that follows it. Because when a child enters your life at 18, it's not just that you now have to do more. It's that your whole emotional structure changes, time changes, ambition changes, fear changes, the stakes change. Your relationship to mistakes changes. Your relationship to yourself changes. And if I'm honest, I don't think many young men are emotionally prepared for that, even when they step up and try to do the right thing. At 18, most people are still becoming. They're still trying on identities, still figuring out who they are when nobody's depending on them in a life-shaping way. They're still making mistakes, mostly theirs to make. They still have room for confusion, for drift, for slowness, for self-discovery. But when fatherhood begins that early, life often stops giving you that room. You don't get the same amount of space to be uncertain in peace. You don't get the same amount of time to figure yourself out before other people need something solid from you. You're still becoming a man, but now you're also expected to act like one in the fullest sense of the word. And that can build something in you very quick. It can build seriousness, it can build endurance, responsibility, it can make you work hard. It can make you more aware of consequence than a lot of people your age. It can make you understand very early that life is not theoretical anymore. But it can also make you skip things. It can make you become more practical before you become reflective. It can make you become useful before you become emotionally literate. It can make you more comfortable carrying that communicating. And that's important. I think I've fallen in the trap of carrying rather than communicating so often. And it's difficult because it makes you more familiar with pressure than with rest. More used to doing what has to be done than asking yourself what all of that is doing to you. I think that's one of the reasons some men who had responsibility early struggle later in ways other people don't always understand. Because the world often praises the visible side of what was built. It praises the resilience, the graft, the dependability, the maturity. But it doesn't always pay much attention to the emotional conditions those things were built in. And conditions matter. If responsibility built you, then pressure probably built part of you. If duty shaped you, then fear probably shaped part of you too. If survival taught you how to function, then there is a good chance survival also taught you things that were useful then, but are heavier to carry now. And that's something I've had to understand about myself. There have been long stretches of my life where pushing through felt more natural than reflecting. Carrying things alone felt more natural than asking for help. Staying useful felt more familiar than being honest about what something cost me. Putting myself lower down the list felt like adulthood, not a pattern. And because those things can look like discipline from the outside, it's easy to miss when there are also forms of self-erasure. That's one of the reasons I wanted to make this episode. Because I think a lot of men are still living inside patterns that were built when life got heavy too early. And instead of seeing those patterns clearly, they just call them personality. They say, that's just how I am. I'm just hard-headed. I'm just quiet. I'm just not the kind of man who talks much. I'm just the one who gets on with it. And maybe some of that is temperament, but maybe not all of it. Maybe some of it is adaptation. Maybe some of it is what happens when life taught you very early that there wasn't much room for softness, not much room for confusion, not much room for collapse, not much room for being anything other than the person who carries what needs to be carried. That can make you strong. That can make a man strong. But it can also make him hard in ways he doesn't notice until much later. I think growing up through responsibility builds strength and blindness at the same time. It teaches you how to endure, but it doesn't always teach you how to understand yourself. It teaches you how to stay standing, but not always how to recover. It teaches you how to protect others, but not always how to care for what is happening inside you. And that matters. Because if a man builds his whole way of being around usefulness, he can go years without asking who he is when he's not solving something, providing something, carrying something, fixing something, or suppressing something. And I think a lot of fathers know exactly what that feels like. There's a kind of life where usefulness becomes identity. You are the one who works, the one who figures things out, the one who takes the pressure, the one who keeps moving, the one who doesn't make things worse by falling apart. And over time, that can become such a normal role that you stop noticing its cost. That cost can show up in different ways. Sometimes it shows up in your body. You get run down, you get out of shape, you lose energy. Your body starts reflecting years of being treated like the least urgent thing in your own life. Sometimes it shows up emotionally. You become more distant, less patient, more flat, less expressive, more contained than you mean to be. And sometimes it shows up relationally. People know you're there for them, but they don't really know what it costs you to keep being there. They know your function more than they know your inner life. Sometimes it shows up in how hard it becomes to rest. You sit down, but you don't switch off. You take a break, but you don't soften. You stop moving, but your mind keeps scanning because it's trained to live on alert. And I think one of the hardest parts is that those patterns can feel normal when they started early enough. That's been true in my own life because becoming a father at 18 was not the only thing. Life kept adding weight. At 21, I went through something that changed me deeply. We experienced a stillbirth because the ambulance did not arrive in time. I had to deliver the baby myself at home. Even saying that plainly without dramatizing it says enough. It was traumatic. It was traumatic for my partner in an immense and devastating way. And I want to be very clear about that. The mother's trauma in child loss is enormous, intimate, physical, emotional, and often rightly receives a lot of attention and care. But I also think there's a side of that experience that doesn't get talked about enough for fathers. And that's that a father can be inside the trauma too deeply and still feel that his role is to function first, to hold first, to support first, to stay practical first, to absorb what is happening and still somehow remain useful. I think a lot of fathers who've been through child loss, stillbirth, or medical trauma around birth will understand this. The grief is real. The shock is real. The helplessness is real. But often the father's internal experience gets folded into the role he's expected to play. And because the focus understandably centers so much on the mother, the father's pain can go underground very quickly. Not because it's less real, not because it's less serious, but because he often feels there's no room for his own collapse. He becomes the support system while something life-altering is also happening to him. That side of fatherhood grief is not talked about enough. And I think when something like that happens to a man who already learnt young how to carry pressure, it doesn't just hurt him in the moment. It can deepen the patterns that were already there. It can deepen the containment, the silence, the hard-headedness, the instinct to keep moving, the habit of burying your own emotional reality inside function. And once again, that can look like strength from the outside. But sometimes it's not strength in the purest sense. Sometimes it's survival doing what it knows. Then life kept adding more. Second child came at 23. And now later in life, I'm becoming a father again with twins at 36. My oldest was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy at 5, which brought another layer into fatherhood entirely. Another level of weight, another level of mental load, another level of vigilance and emotional containment. There was also work, business pressure, multiple jobs, joblessness, housing pressure, buying and selling homes, supporting my mother and two sisters financially, trying to be a good father, partner, son, brother, and friend through all of it. And I think when life keeps adding layers like that, the patterns built in early responsibility often become even more fixed. You get even more used to carrying, even more used to functioning, even more used to putting yourself further down the list. And because you survive it, and because people often respect you for surviving it, it becomes even harder to ask whether survival mode is now the only way you know how to live. That's something I think a lot of men need to sit with, because surviving is not the same as understanding. Enduring is not the same as integrating. Carrying is not the same as healing. A lot of men grew through pressure, but never really got to process what that growth was made of. And that matters later. It matters when you're older and you notice you still struggle to ask for help. It matters when you notice that rest feels uncomfortable. It matters when you notice that your first instinct is always to be useful, even when what you really need is honesty, support, grief, softness, reflection, or even space. It matters when you realize that some of what you call your personality might actually be older pressure still speaking through you. I think one of the most useful things a father can do, especially one who had responsibility early, is to begin asking better questions about himself. Not questions soaked in shame, not what is wrong with me, but questions that are more truthful. What built this in me? What made this useful once? Why is this still protecting me from? What strengths can come through this? What habits came through this? What am I still doing because life once taught me I had to? What have I mistaken for maturity that might actually be a form of old survival? Those are hard questions. I mean, they were hard for me to get through even, but they are important ones. Because once you understand that some of your patterns were formed under real pressure, you stop seeing yourself only through criticism. You become more accurate. And I think a lot of fathers need more accuracy, not more slogans, not more generic advice, not more polished messages about discipline and leadership, but accuracy. Because maybe you are strong, yes, but maybe you're also carrying too much in the same way you learned to when you were young. Maybe you are resilient, yes, but maybe you're also harder on yourself than you need to be because responsibility taught you early that there was no room for weakness. Maybe you are dependable, yes, but maybe you're also emotionally contained in ways that stop people from really knowing you. Maybe you are practical, yes, but maybe you don't know how to put yourself first without guilt because life trained you too early to see your own needs as secondary. That doesn't make you broken. It doesn't make you bad. It doesn't make your strengths fake. It just means you're formed by pressure. Pressure always leaves a mark. I think that's one of the main truths I want fathers to hear from this episode. If responsibility came early for you, there's a good chance it built some of your best qualities. There's a good chance it built some of the patterns that now make your life heavier than it needs to be. Both can be true. That's important because sometimes men feel like they've to choose one story or the other. Either they say, I was made stronger by what I went through, or they say, I've been damaged by what I went through. But real life's normally more complicated than that. A man can be shaped beautifully and painfully by the same thing. He can become more serious and less soft, more capable and less connected to himself, more resilient and more accustomed to carrying alone, more dependable and less practiced at being understood. I think that's often the real truth. And maybe that's the work later in life. Not pretending the pressure didn't form you, not pretending the pressure only harmed you, but learning how to keep the strength without being ruled by the hardness, learning how to stay dependable without disappearing inside the role, learning how to honor what responsibility built in you whilst also questioning what it took away from you. Learning how to understand yourself as a man who is shaped by pressure without treating pressure as your only language forever. That's not easy work. I don't say any of this like I've completely mastered it. I haven't. I constantly see the patterns in myself, the hard-headedness, the tendency to carry along, the instinct to keep moving, the habit of putting myself lower on the list than I should, the difficulty of switching off, the way usefulness can still feel safer than honesty. So this isn't me speaking from some clean, finished place. This is me speaking as someone who's lived enough to see the pattern more clearly now. And I think clarity is one of the most valuable things we can give ourselves. Because if you can see the pattern, you have more chance of changing how you live with it. If you can't see it, you just keep repeating it and calling it in nature. So when I think about growing up through responsibility, I don't think the story is simply that it makes a man stronger. I think it often makes him stronger and harder, wiser and more tired, more resilient and more emotionally contained, more dependable and less practiced at asking what he needs. And I think a lot of men need permission to admit both sides of that. Because if you only honor the strength, you miss the cost. And if you only focus on the cost, you miss the dignity, the endurance, and seriousness that came through it. The truth is usually both. And maybe the most honest way to end this episode is this. Early responsibility can make a man stronger, can also make him harder. And for a lot of fathers, the real work later in life is learning how to keep the strength without letting the hardness become the whole story. If this resonates, I'd really like to know, do you think early responsibility makes men stronger, harder, or both? That's where I want to leave this one. Thank you.